Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Laurie Santos. I'm very excited to be with you today as part of this School of Life programming to talk to you a little bit about the life skills that you can use to improve your own well-being. But in addition to life skills that you can use to improve your own well-being, also life skills that you can use to feel a little bit better during this really challenging time of COVID-19. And so I'm going to be kind of walking you through some of the things that we learn about in my class. I'll talk a little bit about the history of my class and how I got involved with the School of Life. But then I'll sort of focus a little bit on the misconceptions that you might have about your own happiness. Misconceptions that I think are really important to go over with if we really need to understand what we can do to promote our well-being. And then after that, we'll sort of take some time to focus on the kinds of things you can do to improve your well-being, things that will be useful in general in your life, but especially during this time of COVID-19. And so with that, let me see if I can switch on my PowerPoint so that we can actually see the talk here. And we will get started. So first off, I wanted to tell a little bit about the story of how I got involved with the School of Life and how I got involved with studying well-being quite generally. As you may have heard kind of from the introduction to this series, I am a professor. I'm Professor Santos to all of my students, and I teach at Yale University, this wonderful university in the United States, one of our Ivy League schools. And that's been really fantastic to be a teacher in this wonderful university. I have these wonderful, fantastic students. But for most of my time teaching at Yale, I was a professor at the front of the classroom. I wasn't really involved very closely in student life. But a lot of that changed when I took on a new role at Yale, where I became one of Yale's heads of college. So I'm a head of Silliman College. Yale is one of these funny schools like in Harry Potter, where there's kind of colleges within a college. And I am the head of Silliman College, where I get to live on campus with students. My house is kind of in the courtyard where I live near the students' dorms. I interact with them quite closely. And it was in this new situation that I was really faced with what I wasn't expecting, which was this college mental health crisis up close and personal. I was seeing that my students were more depressed, more unhappy than I really expected. And this was kind of shocking to me because I had maybe the guess about what college student life was like that you might have, which is that college students are pretty happy. You know, if we Google college students, you get images that look like this. These are students who, by and large are kind of happy and, doing the things that they enjoy in life. That's what I was expecting when I got up close and personal with college students, but that really wasn't what I was seeing. In fact, I was seeing this so-called mental health crisis up close and personal. But it wasn't just the students at Yale that were facing this. In fact, this is something that we're facing nationally. But just to give you a sense of what's going on with my Yale students, here's just kind of a quick survey of the sorts of things I was experiencing. I was hearing students say things like, as I reflect on my time at Yale so far, I realize that I've not been able to get the most out of my experience, largely because of all this stress. Lots of students pointed to the stress that they were facing. These students work incredibly hard to get to a place like Yale, but then they get there and then they feel incredibly stressed. Here's another student. People note that people at Yale are often too stressed to enjoy the small pleasures. For example, there's little time at Yale to do the things I love, like read a book. And again, this is something that I was seeing all the time. Students just don't feel like they have great skills to manage their time. And that means that they miss out on the things they enjoy, even simple things like reading a book. Here was another one that was reflected in a lot of the responses. It's very easy to constantly feel behind or inadequate at Yale, which leads to a lot of anxiety. And I know that this isn't just my Yale students, even in the questions that some of you submitted, there was a lot of discussion about what you can do not to feel so behind. This fear of missing out is a real thing, and it's a thing that's reflected in the questions that I saw there. But just a final comment from my Yale student, because I think it really brings home what the students are dealing with. There's a sort of social currency to being the busiest, to getting the least sleep. We don't actually talk about the things that are bothering us. And it takes a real crisis for us to admit that something is actually wrong. And so this is pretty disturbing, but the sad thing is that this isn't just Yale. In fact, if you look nationally at the college statistics in the US, and this is mirrored across the world in college age students, there's a real crisis in mental health. I'll show you the US data because those are the ones I have easy access to, but this is just from a recent National College Health Assessment from 2017. And here's what the statistics reflect. Over 40% of American college students right now report being so depressed it's difficult to function. Over 50% say that they feel hopeless. Over 60% say that they experience overwhelming anxiety, just sort of the highest level of anxiety folks could report on a scale. Another 60% report feeling very lonely most of the time. And over 80% say that they constantly feel overwhelmed by all the things that they have to do. And this is reflected in even yuckier behaviors, like the fact that over 10% of American college students say that they've seriously considered suicide in the last year. And so all of these things are pretty scary, and they led me to reflect on the fact that, this is really bad. Like, whoops, I'm not sure what happened to my slides right there. But to reflect on the fact that, this is really bad. This is the kind of thing that we, really don't want to see in our college students. So I think as universities, we should be worried if our college students are learning the right things. But even as a society, I think we need to be reflecting on the fact that we don't want our young people to be experiencing this level of kind of sadness and this level of depression and anxiety. And so the sad thing is that even though I saw these awful statistics with a certain amount of dire need, I also had a certain amount of hope in dealing with them. And that hope came from the reflection that we knew what we could do to solve this crisis because we had a lot of scientific work on the kinds of things that people can do to feel a little bit happier. And this work is reflected in the fact that we've had over 2 decades worth of work on the science of happiness, research that's gone on to try to look at what are the kinds of things that you can do to feel happier right now. And there's a few ways that this research goes. I think it's kind of funny to think about taking a scientific approach to happiness, but it's actually one that really is quite common. In fact, the way the research works is that researchers go out and they find happy people. You can find them out there all over the place, especially in the UAE. But once you find those happy people, then you ask a few things. You say, okay, what are these happy people doing differently? How do they spend their time? What jobs do they have? How much money do they have? What are these folks doing differently that maybe I'm not doing? And then once you get those first hints, you can do something to test those intuitions. You can bring in not so happy people to the lab, say, and then force them to do the things that happy people do. And then you can test whether or not those new behaviors actually allow individuals to become happier than you expect. And as I said, we've now had several decades of work that's done just this. We've gotten very specific insights into the kinds of things that do and don't promote well-being. And we could use those insights to try to make people's lives better. And so that was how I got into the well-being research and how I decided to develop a totally new class for my Yale students. I wanted to teach them about the science of well-being. And I set it up so that it was had a really cool name. I kind of christened it Psychology in the Good Life, so my students would want to take the class and be very excited about it. And importantly, it was a course in which I gave them 2 distinct parts. And these 2 parts are going to be important as you think about the tips that I'm going to talk to you about in this webinar, because you need to not think just about the science, you need to think about putting that science into practice. And so the 2 parts of the class that the students got were first the scientific part. That's what you're going to hear a lot about today. You're going to see the same graphs and the same studies as my students saw, because I think it's important to know that the things I'm telling you are really evidence-based practices. But in addition, you're going to hear something else, and that's what my students heard too. The second part of their class was that I wanted them to put the science of happiness into practice. I didn't want them to just hear about it. I wanted them to actually use it in a very significant way. And this is reflected in something that's an analogy I use with my students, which is, imagine if instead of being worried about college student mental health, I was really worried about college student physical health, and I really wanted them to exercise. And so I decided to teach a whole class on the science of exercise, where I taught students, how their abdominal muscles work and how their leg muscles work. And they learn all about the science of what they should be doing when they go to the gym. But what if they never actually went to the gym? Nothing would change, right? You need to actually put what you learn into practice. And that's just what we've seen in the science of happiness. What the science teaches us is there are things we can do to promote our happiness. There are interventions we can take to feel better, but we actually have to do those interventions. We actually have to put them into practice. And that was why, in addition to the normal course requirements for the class, like a midterm and a final paper, I also gave students something that I christened course rewirements. And the rewirements were there to kind of rewire students' habits over time, to kind of teach them the right things to do. I couldn't make students do these for a grade, but I was able to list all these different rewirement activities in the syllabus. And it turned out that that was enough for my kind of type A, sort of very intense Yale students. They really still wanted to put these things into practice. And these are things that we're going to talk about in this session today. Things like the importance of taking time for gratitude, taking time for social connection, taking time to savor important moments, and even healthy practices, things like meditation and exercise and sleep. Those were the things that students were assigned to do as part of this class. And so I wasn't sure what would happen next. I sort of submitted the syllabus to Yale, expecting 30 or 40 students to take the class because it was a completely new class. And I was really blindsided by this image here, which is what actually happened. Over a quarter of the students in Yale College decided to take the class, which is just around over 1,000 students decided to take it. The class was so popular Then we had to teach it inside a concert hall rather than a classroom. So that was a bit unexpected, a little surreal to have such a huge impact on the campus at Yale. But what happened next was even more unexpected, which is that the class just didn't go viral on campus. It actually went viral beyond campus. So we had a ton of national press in the US about the class, where the idea behind the press seemed to be that, these Yale students are very young, they're at an Ivy League university, they should be happy, but they're not. And the question seemed to be, well, what about the rest of us? What are these tips so that the rest of us can learn them too? But the press continued not just nationally, but internationally, where I had all kinds of articles from all around the world in lots of different languages about the class. And I don't speak lots of these languages. So if you know what these articles are saying, you can tell me afterwards or send me an email. But all of this national press led me to the connection that I have now with the School of Life, which is that having seen the press, Her Excellency Al Rumi reached out to try to make a connection, to try to talk more about all the work that she's been doing as part of this new national program for happiness and well-being. I admit it wasn't something that I knew a lot about when I first proposed the class, but it was so fantastic to hear that the UAE was thinking about building happiness and well-being into their government platforms to try to figure out what government agencies can do to promote happiness among its citizens. And this is where the School of Life comes in. I'm hopeful that you know about the School of Life since you're taking this webinar, but if not, this is a new program that started back in 2018 to give the folks who are to give folks actual skills in terms of ways that they can improve their happiness. The School of Life provides programming like this webinar to teach people skill sets that they might use to be able to improve their well-being. And it's focused on a couple of different platforms in terms of promoting these well-being skills, not just thinking about well-being skills as you see on the right, but to use those skills as ways to boost people's mental well-being. It has the mission of actually making folks happier across time, but it does that through a couple key features. One is, as you see on the left, strengthening family and community cohesion, really having a deep focus on social connections, and also working to allow individuals the tools they need to adopt positive thinking as a key value. And the hope is that the School of Life can provide these kinds of tools through webinars like this. And so I hope I'll help contribute to that. But that was my kind of quick story of an introduction to how I got involved in this well-being research and quickly my story. Now I'm going to spend the rest of this webinar walking through a couple things that we know is really critical for learning about the science of well-being. And those are focusing on the misconceptions that we have about what makes us happy and the kinds of things that we can do to feel a little bit happier. And so we'll start on how you can overcome your misconceptions, because I think this is really critical. One of the main features that we've learned about the science of happiness is that we have incredibly strong intuitions about the kinds of things that will make us happy. But by and large, a lot of those intuitions seem to be wrong. And so it's critical to try to overcome those intuitions before we put the healthy practices in place. Otherwise, we might be going about this, doing it a little bit worse than we might expect. And so we'll dive into some of these misconceptions. The first one of these that I think is really quite critical is that we often think that happiness is something that's built in, but that is a misconception. We actually can control a lot more of our happiness than we think. And so, in the US, we have this analogy of the idea that some people in life look at the glass as being half full, everything's great in life, everyone's so optimistic, whereas other people tend to look at the glass as half empty. It's kind of really sad, things are bad, things are sad, and so on. But of course, a glass that's half empty and a glass that is half full are the same glass. It just depends on your perspective. But I start with this analogy because I think we can get in the habit of just thinking that these kinds of perspectives are in some sense built in, right? That in some sense we're born with these different perspectives on whether or not we're an optimist or a pessimist. But is that really the case? Is there a genetic component to happiness? Well, that's what researcher Sonia Lyubomirsky and her colleagues set out to study. She has a wonderful book called The How of Happiness, which I really recommend to folks if you want to learn more about this topic. But she tackled this big problem, which is to ask how much of our well-being seems to be built into our genes. Now, this is a tough problem because there's not just a genetic effect on our well-being or any aspect of our behavior. There's these rich epigenetic interactions between the genes and environment, so it's quite tricky. But if you look at different studies of twins and identical twins who have the same genetics versus fraternal twins who have different genetics, they're just brothers and sisters, what you find, to make a very long story short, is that even though we think that happiness might be built into our genes, the research suggests that it's not as much as we think. There's probably around a 40% or 50% heritability to happiness, but that means that a lot of it is still under our control. There's a lot of things we can do to affect this stuff. So that's kind of misconception number one. We think happiness is built in, but it seems not to be. But there's a second misconception that comes up. And that's when we think, okay, if happiness is not in our genes, what is the rest of happiness? And that's where we often think that our circumstances play a huge role. You know, if you become incredibly wealthy and you get all the success in life, that will lead to happiness. But if bad things happen, say you get sick or say you don't have the circumstances you want, that will lead to unhappiness. In the US, we have this expression that, poop happens, or it's even more kind of vulgar than that. But we think that happiness is getting rid of all the bad things in life, all the poop in life, and just having only good circumstances, and then everything will be great. But it turns out that's going to be our second misconception about happiness, which is that our life circumstances end up not mattering as much for our happiness as we often think, which I think is really critical. How do we know this? Well, researchers go out and they study folks who've had really fantastic life circumstances, folks who've had the kinds of things that many people dream of. One of the examples is looking at people who have won the lottery. So this is a famous lottery in the US called Powerball, where this lucky woman has just won 758 million US dollars. And the question is, does that make her happier? Well, to be totally honest, on the day that she won the Powerball, yes, she's pretty happy. I mean, you can even see it in the photo. She's sort of smiling from ear to ear. The question is just, does that sustain her happiness? So if we come back in 6 months or we come back a year later, will this woman still be as happy as that? And what the research suggests is no. It seems like if you come back 6 months later, this woman will likely have returned to her baseline level of happiness. Now, that's often not what we think. We think if we got this huge windfall of millions of dollars, we'd feel happier. But the research suggests that's just not the case. Those are people who have really fantastic life circumstances. Let's look at people who've had some bad life circumstances, like this individual here. Say, you're crossing the street and you're not paying attention and you get hit by a car. And you have some bad news about your injury. You've lost the use of your legs. You sever your spine and now you're paraplegic. If you're listening to this and you're lucky enough to have the use of your legs, you don't have that luxury anymore. What would this do to your happiness? Well, what we predict is that this would feel awful for our happiness, that this would lead to a sustained downturn in our happiness for a very, very long time. But what the research suggests is that if you go talk to these folks who've really had an accident like this and become paraplegic, what you find is that 6 months later, 1 year later, their happiness is no different than it was before baseline. In other words, even a sustained, really bad change in our life circumstances doesn't matter for our happiness as much as we think. And so that gets us back to this diagram that we had here before. Happiness is not built into our genes. That's sort of misconception number one. But happiness is also not built into our circumstances. We don't have to only have good things in life happen. We don't have to only get rid of all the bad things in life to improve our happiness. And that is really, really critical. So critical, in fact, that I think it's worth reminding us of how this plays out in the context of this COVID-19 crisis. Many of us at the start of this crisis might have thought, well, I can't be happy if I'm, stuck in my house with my kids, or I can't be happy if I've lost my job, or I can't be happy, if I can't see my family members, and so on. And that is probably, just like the paraplegic example, true at the start of this event. But over time, we're going to feel a little bit better about these things. That's what the research really suggests. We're in the beginning of this crisis, so it might not feel it, but the data suggests that even the worst of events in our lives, we can get used to. And that should give us some, I think, important hope as we think about how to tackle this crisis moving forward, that even in the worst of circumstances, we can be okay. And so that was kind of misconception number two, is that our life circumstances sort of matter a lot. But then that still raises the question that you see from the graph: if our happiness is not fully embedded in our genes and our happiness is not fully embedded in our circumstances, what's the other part? And the answer is that the other part is our behaviors and our mindsets. We can actively change our mindset and actively change our behavior to improve our happiness over time. We just have to do so. And that gets to another misconception, which is that kind of, in some sense, happiness is easy. But that's unfortunately not what the data suggests. The data suggests that you can become happier. You can take action to change your mood and your well-being levels. But like all good things in life, it's going to take some work. And so I just turned back to this wonderful quote by Sonia Lyubomirsky. I really love her work. And so she has a wonderful quote in her book, which explains this. She notes, "It may be obvious that to achieve anything substantial in life, to either learn a profession or master a sport or raise a child, that a good deal of effort is required." She goes on to say, "Research reveals that if you desire happiness, you need to go about it in a similar way. It's going to take permanent changes that require effort and commitment every day of your life." In some sense, it's just like all the other good things you're working on in life. You just have to put the work in. And this is why one of my students christened the class hardest class at Yale, which is a little hashtag they used on Twitter. I think, in some ways it was a joke in that it wasn't really a hard academic class. In some ways it was like a reasonable academic class. But if you really wanted to achieve what the class promised, which is improved well-being, you really had to work at it. And I think this is something also to remind ourselves in the context of this crisis, is that we can experience this crisis in all kinds of different ways. We can take all kinds of different mindsets to it. But the key is that we really need to remember that the right mindsets, the mindsets that are going to allow us to get through this crisis in a resilient and in a strong way, they might not come totally easy. They might require at least a little bit of work, or at least a little bit of time to put those things into practice. The good news is that that comes with a huge benefit, where we'll feel a lot better over time. And so that was misconception number 3. Happiness is just easy. It doesn't take any work. Unfortunately, it takes some work. And that gets us to misconception number 4, which we'll spend some time on, because I think this is the hardest amount of work that we need to put in for our happiness, which is to overcome a certain set of intuitions that we have in our mind. And the biggest one is that if we want to be happy, we need to come to terms with the fact that our mind is lying to us a lot of the time about the sorts of things that make us happy. And so this is kind of a strange notion, this idea that our minds lie to us. But you've probably seen other cases where our minds seem to fib a little bit to us. One of them is in the context of visual illusions. Hopefully this is working on your webinar screen, but if you look at those black dots in these circles, it might look as though some of the circles are moving. That's not a trick of this YouTube video or this Zoom window or even my PowerPoint. It's a stationary image that you're looking at. It just looks like it's moving because of the features of this image trip up your visual system. Your visual system thinks things are moving when actually everything is stationary. And we often like videos that look like this. In the US, and I think around the world, we had this image of the dress that went around that was either white and gold or black and blue. And so people thought about that visual illusion. We like visual illusions because they're funny. It's funny to us when our perceptual systems lie. It's kind of interesting. But it's not as interesting when our motivational systems lie to us. The idea that we are seeking out things that we really think are going to make us happier, but actually when we get those things, we're not as happy as we think. And this is the central point that we're going to walk through in a lot of detail right now, this idea that our minds seem to lie to us about the kinds of things that make us happy. What is one thing that our mind lies to us about in terms of our happiness? Well, one is just money. We talked about the lottery example before. Many of us believe that if we got more of this, we'd be happy, but is that really the case? Well, it's definitely something that we believe. It's definitely something that my college students believe. Here's a graph from US college students who were asked what's very important in life or what's really essential in life. And this is a study that's looked across the decades at what students say. And what you can see here is that over time, students have been reporting that being very well off financially is incredibly important to them. Which is kind of ironic because if you look at a different question, how important is it to say develop a meaningful philosophy on life? That's kind of gone down over time. And I love this question in part because it shows how important it is to have something like a school of life, because we kind of get wrong the importance of having these philosophies on how to live a good life. But that's what people think. But we could ask a different question, which is what amount of money do people really think they need to be happy? And do you ever get satisfied when you get more? That's just what this other research question looked at. They asked a different question. They asked, what number could I put on your annual salary check that would allow you to be just happy? What's an amount of money that you could earn that if you got any more, it wouldn't really matter. It wouldn't make you much happier. Well, researchers go out and they ask folks, they do this in the US, where they ask people at different income levels. They ask folks in the US who are currently earning $30,000 a year, which is like a little bit, below middle class income right here. And they ask, what do you think you should be earning? Well, these folks will say, if I only got $50,000 a year, I would be happy, right? So in theory, we should be able to ask the folks who are earning $50,000 a year if they're happy, and they should all say, yes, I don't need any more money. These researchers did one better. They looked at folks who were currently earning $100,000 a year and asked if those folks were happy. The answer, unfortunately, is no. But when you ask those folks how much money they need, they say they would need $250,000 to be happy. And so a couple things here. One is that you don't actually reach your goal even when you get more money. But what's more insidious is that the goal gets further away. So it's not that you get closer to your goal of finances. You want more money as you get richer and richer, which is kind of sad. But we could ask a different question. We could ask, okay, that's just what people think they need. But if you really looked carefully at people's measures of well-being, is there a salary level at which getting more money doesn't make you happy? And that's just what these two researchers did. This is Danny Kahneman and Angus Deaton. They both won Nobel Prizes for their work. And they did this particular thing, again, looking at US numbers, because those were the numbers they had available. They tried to look at different levels of US salary and 3 different measures of people's well-being. And so I'll kind of walk through these because it's a sort of complicated graph. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, which I can see on the screen, but if you're seeing my cursor, I'm looking at the annual income that's running along the bottom axis here, and it's going up logarithmically, which means it's getting bigger jumps as you go across. So $10 to $20,000 is a small jump, but then 20 to 40 is doubling that, 40 to 80, and so on. Then I'm showing you a couple of different measures of people's well-being. Those are the dashed lines that you see here. That top dashed line where it says positive affect, that is the dashed line that maps on to your positive emotion. And so the question is, do you increase positive emotion as your salary goes up? Do you experience more joy, more laughter, and so on? The number that's right under that is whether you're not feeling blue. So that's the absence of your negative emotions. In other words, like you say you don't feel sad, you don't feel angry, and so on. And then that last dashed line is when you report being stress-free. So this is where you're saying that I don't feel stressed, I'm kind of feeling happy, and so on. And the question is, what happens to those lines? Well, you can all see that all of those dashed lines of well-being seem to go up as people get richer and richer. In other words, as your salary goes up, well-being does go up. But that's only for low levels of income. The other thing you see is that all of those dashed lines seem to level off. They get flatlined. And they get flatlined in the US right now at a particular income, which is around $75,000. What does that mean? That means once you're earning $75,000, at least in the US, what happens is that even if I were to double or triple your salary, you're not getting any corresponding increase in your well-being. Now, that's really not what we expect, but it's what the data suggest. So getting more money after a certain point just doesn't increase your happiness. And so money is not making us happy in the way we think, even though we have this intuition that much more money would make us happy. But also the things that money can buy don't make us happy. You know, the big, huge houses or the really nice cars. We assume that these things will make us happy, but in practice, they seem not to. In fact, there is a correlation between materialism and happiness. So being the kind of person that seeks out material goods, but it's a negative correlation. In other words, the more material goods you get, the less happy you seem to be. And so we've seen hints of that correlation already when you look at happiness measures across time. And so if we look at folks' general happiness in the 1950s, here's kind of a picture of the typical US family in the 1950s. You know, they didn't have the stuff that we have today, you know, really huge houses, you know, huge cars, computers, all the technology gadgets we have. You know, we've improved that to when the study was done, which is in 2005, so a little bit of time ago, but definitely much more technology than now. Has our happiness improved with all these extra material possessions? Well, in the US, the mean happiness was around a 7 out of 10 before. And if anything, it was slightly higher back in the 1950s. And this disconnect between our material wealth and our happiness has caused a lot of scholars to talk about this kind of paradox. It's one that David Myers referred to as the American paradox, because I think it's particularly important in the US culture, but I think it's also just as relevant in the UAE. We've gotten materially wealthier, but that hasn't necessarily mapped onto our happiness. And here's just David Myers' quote about this. He notes, compared with their grandparents, today's young adults have grown up with much more affluence, slightly less happiness, and much greater risk of depression and assorted social pathologies. He goes on to note that our becoming much better off over the last 4 decades has not been accompanied by one iota of increased subjective well-being. The material goods just aren't doing the work that we think. And so this raises a big question, this misconception, which is like, why don't these things make us happy? You know, we're getting more material wealth. Like, why isn't that doing the effect that we often think? And to understand that, we need to dive a little bit deeper into one of the ways that our minds lead us astray. And that is the phenomena of what's called hedonic adaptation. To illustrate hedonic adaptation, I want to show you an example of a different kind of adaptation in your mind, sort of perceptual adaptation. You'll see I often sort of use visual illusions like the ones you saw before to illustrate these points. But perceptual adaptation is when your mind so gets used to something that it's seeing that it kind of gets bored with it. It's almost like expecting something else afterwards. And I'll show you an example of this. Again, I hope this works over your Zoom window. In a second, I'm going to show you an image. And I want you to stare at that image really closely, like really kind of look directly at it as though you're staring at it. And I'm going to hold it on for a couple seconds, and I'm going to make it disappear, and you're going to see what happens. And so here's the image. Stare at it really closely. Stare, stare, stare. And then when I make it go away, hopefully some of you will have had a little flash of a different image, which is the UAE flag. I'm not sure how many of you got it. You can tell me afterwards. But that is perceptual adaptation. Like as you get used to a certain set of colors, your mind gets so bored with them that when the image goes away, it actually your visual system fires with the opposite colors because it was expecting them for so much. That's perceptual adaptation. We get so used to stuff in the world. That's what we expect to see over and over again. But it doesn't just happen in perception. It also happens in the context of our emotions about the good things in life that we experience. Our hedonic adaptation is a problem too. And to see hedonic adaptation in action, I'll sort of give you over to Dan Gilbert, who's a professor at Harvard. He has some wonderful examples of this, and he talks about hedonic adaptation really nicely in his book, Stumbling on Happiness. But here's his quote about it. He notes that wonderful things are especially wonderful the first time they happen, but their wonderfulness wanes with repetition. Dan uses the example of the first time your partner says, I love you. That felt amazing, the first time they said it, but, when they said, I love you last week, maybe not as good. Or the same thing, an example of your child, the first time your child says, mommy or daddy, like that can just feel amazing. But, last week when they said it, no big deal. This is hedonic adaptation. It means the good things in life stop being that good. And it explains a lot of the reasons that we don't always enjoy the good things in life, why more money doesn't continue to make us happy. Let's see the hedonic adaptation happening in the context of money. Here's just one study on this by Ditella and colleagues. They used a German data set, a very large German data set across the 2 decades worth of data. And they plotted people's salary over time and their happiness. And the question is, as people went up in salary over time, because if you start with young people, they tend to kind of increase in salary over time, does that map onto increased happiness? And that's the graph I'll show you here. I'm first plotting people's real income in this German data set over time. And as you can see, as you might expect in these decades, it goes up. But the question is, what happens to their happiness? It just flatlines. So these increases that we're having in our salary, getting more and more money, they don't make us happy because every time we get a new increase, we just get used to that. It just brings us back to the normal status quo. So you get used to lots of money. You also get used to awesome stuff, which is the reason that awesome stuff doesn't help us. When you first get a really nice new car, it might feel good. It might feel better than your old, not as good car. But then over time, you just get used to all these new features. And Dan Gilbert has a very funny quote about this. He notes, part of us believes that the new car is better because it lasts longer. But he goes on to say, but in fact, that's the worst thing about the car. It will stick around to disappoint you. The material goods that we buy in life, we end up getting bored with because we just kind of get used to them over time. But that doesn't necessarily stop us from going out to buy new material possessions, even though they're not going to give us the kind of happiness increase that we often really believe. That's this fake intuition about what material goods are going to do. And that's why, at least in the US, one of the growing industries we see, kind of embarrassingly, is the industry of storage buildings for people who have so many material goods that they can't even use, that they need to store them to pay some facility to store them at. It's a real sign that we're just so bored with our stuff that we don't even need it anymore. And so you're getting used to awesome stuff, but in part because the School of Life is so much about relationships, I also wanted to point out that you also can get used to a great marriage. These relationships that build so much happiness when they first start, we can also get bored with those. And just to see kind of some data on this is some data showing hedonic adaptation over time in marriages by Lucas. So you ask people about their life satisfaction. So bigger numbers are higher life satisfaction. And these are years until your marriage. That 0 point is when you get married. And what you can see is that people have a sort of spike up in their happiness when they first get married. But over, a couple years, that kind of goes away over time, which is pretty sad. We want to continue getting this happiness increase from our marriages. And so the point of hedonic adaptation explains why we have these bad theories. It's that we just get used to the good stuff in life, but we simply don't realize it. That's the bad part of hedonic adaptation. But there's a good part of hedonic adaptation too, which is that in addition to getting used to the good things in life, we also get used to the bad things in life. The things that like we don't really enjoy, becoming paraplegic, for example, losing one's job, and so on. These awful situations in life, while at first affecting us a lot, over time don't affect us as much as we think. And here's another spot where I can't help but bring up the current crisis that we're all experiencing. Right now it feels really bad, but over time it kind of it becomes the kind of thing you get used to. Again, it's not perfect, but you get used to these things over time. Here in the US, we've now been sheltering in place almost for a month. And I can say what kind of felt frantic before is kind of, becomes the sort of thing that I'm accustomed to over time. The good news is that once we get out of this, we'll get kind of a burst of new experiences that we won't have adapted yet to. All those things that we took for granted before, like being able to go out to restaurants or being able to see our families, those we got hedonically adapted to, but now taking a little break will allow us to enjoy those in even more earnest over time. And so, as you're thinking about some of the things you might not be enjoying about this COVID-19 situation, recognize that your hedonic adaptation will kick in too. In other words, you're going to be able to get used to these things, even though they seem to be quite bad right now. And so that's for the bad things. We like having hedonic adaptation for the bad things in life, but we really want to stop hedonic adaptation for the good things in life. Our marriages, the things we enjoy in life, our material possessions, we want to be able to enjoy those more over time. And so that raises the question of how we can fight hedonic adaptation to continue experiencing all the good stuff. And there's a couple different techniques we can use. One is when we think about spending our money and putting our time into things, we should be investing in experiences, not stuff. Because stuff, these material possessions that we pay for, they're going to stick around for a long time, which means that we have the opportunity to get hedonically adapted to them. Like this new car will feel awesome, the first time you drive it, but time number 100 that you drive it, you'll just be bored with it. However, if you instead invested your money in experiences, like a lovely vacation or, a fun concert or, a trip to an art gallery, those things don't last long enough for you to get bored with them. They don't last long enough to suffer from hedonic adaptation. And that means that they give us more happiness bang for our buck. And again, I love Dan Gilbert on this. And so he goes on to note that, this new car, it's going to stick around to disappoint you, but experiences don't do that. He says, but a trip to Europe, that's over. It evaporates. It has the good sense to go away, and you are left with nothing but a wonderful memory. And so that's one way we can fight hedonic adaptation is to invest in experiences. And just to see some of the data on this, here's a study by Leif van Boven and his colleagues. They ask people to think back. And so you can play along at home. Think back about $100 either experience that you purchased, so maybe a vacation or something nice, or a $100 material purchase that you made. And then he asked colleagues, how did it make you feel? And what people think when they look retrospectively back on their experiences versus their material purchases is that experiential purchases make us feel happier. That bar for the experiences is much happier in terms of how it made us feel. And so you can get the benefit of this after the fact yourself by investing in experiences, not in stuff. That's one way to fight hedonic adaptation. But I wanted to dive into another way to fight hedonic adaptation that I think is really powerful right now during COVID-19, which is that if we want to fight hedonic adaptation, we need to find ways to savor the good things in life, to kind of fight hedonic adaptation in the moment, to notice the good stuff we're experiencing. So often we have these enjoyable moments in life that we don't take time to savor, to really pay attention to. And that could be a lovely experience like this ice cream, but it could be our material possessions. When's the last time you took a moment to savor, say, your cell phone? Like it's just this wonderful technology that we didn't have access to for most of human history. It's kind of amazing that we get to do all the things on it. That moment of noticing the good things is what the act of savoring is about. And it can be quite powerful. There's also a lot of research suggesting that taking the time to savor can be incredibly powerful in our marriages. And one way to do it is through a technique that's known as negative visualization. Negative visualization is an ancient technique that came to us from the Stoics, the Greek and Roman philosophers who thought about it. But I think it was most nicely emphasized in a very cheesy American movie that we show during the holidays known as It's a Wonderful Life. If you've seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life, you know that the premise is that the protagonist thinks that he's never born. So he thinks like, what if I was never even born? And he sees how bad life would be like if he wasn't really there to be part of it. And then he becomes incredibly grateful that he actually was there in the first place. That's negative visualization. It's this wonderful ancient technique, as I said before, that comes from the ancient Stoics, particularly folks like Epictetus and Seneca. But the act is really simple. You just think about a good thing in your life and imagine that you never had it. So your children, right? For those of you out there who are parents, imagine that they were never born, right? That quick moment where you image something not being present can make you realize all the benefits that you had from it and all the things you love about it. And it can make you appreciate things a little bit more. This is what the Stoics referred to when they talked about negative visualization. They called it the premeditatio malorum. So you're thinking about the bad things in advance, premeditating all the bad things, premeditating the evils in life. But the idea is that by doing that, it causes you to appreciate the good things that you have right now. And here's just one study by Kuh et al. That showed this. It's kind of a version of the It's a Wonderful Life. They have partners come in, and in one condition, partners do negative visualization. They have to write about how you might never have met your partner. So you can think about this yourself. If you're in a relationship, what if you've never met your partner? What if they were never in your life? What would that do to your life right now? Versus a condition where you just talk about how you met your partner. You're not negatively visualizing what your life would be like without them. And what the researchers find when you look at people's happiness rating in their marriage is that those that do the negative visualization condition have this kind of burst of gratitude and appreciation for their partner, this burst of kind of breaking through their hedonic adaptation so they can know what really matters in life, which is really quite powerful. And so this idea of sort of thinking of what it would be like to let the good things that we love go, might seem a little sad, but it's a powerful technique for recognizing the things that we really do appreciate in life and fighting hedonic adaptation so we can keep hold of the good things and use them well. And I think that this technique of negative visualization and savoring can be incredibly powerful during COVID-19. I think during a crisis like this, we can constantly start thinking about all the things we don't have. We can't go out to the park, or I can't see my friend, I can't do this and I can't do that. But what about remembering the awesome things that we do have, counting your blessings and doing so by thinking, well, what if I didn't have that? What if I had to survive COVID-19 without the internet? Or what if I had to survive COVID-19 without the people I care about around me? Those little moments of negative visualization can be incredibly powerful during this crisis to make you realize the blessings that you do have and the things that you do want to keep remembering over time. And so that is taking time to savor the good stuff in life. But there's a final technique I wanted to talk about in the context of fighting hedonic adaptation that I think can be quite powerful. And that's the use of this emotion of gratitude. Gratitude being this emotion of feeling thankful, just like appreciating all the benefits in your life and taking a moment to really reflect on those. Research suggests that gratitude can powerfully reduce hedonic adaptation because when you think what you're grateful for about a particular thing, be it your car, your iPhone, or your marriage, you start to realize all the wonderful things. You stop taking them for granted as hedonic adaptation would expect. And one very simple technique for doing so is to actually literally write down the things that you're grateful for every night. This is what's often called the 3 benefits exercise, where you just kind of write down a few benefits every day. But the research suggests that it can significantly increase your happiness in as little as about 2 weeks, which is really quite powerful. But there's an even more powerful way to fight hedonic adaptation with gratitude that can maximize your happiness, not just because you're fighting hedonic adaptation, but can give you a boost of happiness separately. And that's the act of thanking people that you care about directly, particularly in the context of relationships and close relationships. Often the things that we're most grateful for in life are the people in our life, but we don't take time to ever thank them. But the research suggests that doing so can be incredibly powerful. And just to show you how powerful, I'll show you this one data set from Marty Seligman and colleagues. Here's the prompt that his subjects had. He said, in the next week, I want you to write a letter of gratitude to someone who's helped you or been especially kind to you, but someone you've never really properly thanked. And then deliver that letter in person to the person in question. So you have to go kind of hang out with them. And then in the best case scenario, he wants you to read that letter to the person that you care about so that they can really see how much they've affected you. People don't make a strong prediction that this is going to feel good, but it does feel incredibly good, and it feels good for a really long time. Here's Seligman's graph. I'm plotting happiness on the y-axis, and I'm going to be comparing the gratitude visit, which is the white bars, versus the black bars, which is your placebo control. In other words, you're just writing down your happy memories. So you might get some boost, but not a big one. And so before the test, there's no difference between the gratitude visit and the control. After the test, you get a pretty big bump up in happiness. But what's really amazing is that bump up in happiness lasts. It lasts at least significantly for a whole month, which is kind of incredible. If I started this webinar by telling you there was an activity that you could do that could bump up your happiness for a whole month, you'd be well into the summertime and still experiencing more happiness. That would be pretty incredible. And that's the power of gratitude. And it's one of the reasons I think that gratitude can be an especially important strategy in the context of COVID-19, because it can really allow us to notice the things that are blessings right now. Again, there's a lot of things that are bad. We need to validate it. There are a lot of things that are scary and sad and uncertain. But, there are still the tiny joys in life. They're the things that we're grateful for, even in the face of this pandemic. Taking time to experience that gratitude, and if it's about a person expressing that gratitude, can be an incredibly powerful way to boost your well-being and the well-being of the people around you too. And so that is the final misconception. As I said, we're going to kind of do a deep dive on that one, that our minds seem to lie to us about what makes us happy. We think it's things like money and things like material possessions, but it's really not. The good news is there's strategies we can use to bump that up, but a better thing would be to focus on the things that are going to actually make us happy. And that's why I start this lecture with this image here, which I think is quite powerful, because the research really suggests that we can control our happiness. We can take action to kind of build it and draw it over time. We just need to know the right things to do. And the rest of the lecture is going to be those right things to do, the things that really matter for our happiness. And I'm going to be focusing on 4 things in particular. And these are also the things that I think the School of Life is really talking about in detail, because they want folks to focus on these things in particular. And so what are the 4 things that really matter for happiness? Well, we'll start with the first one, which is that if we want to be happy, we really need to focus on social connections and healthy relationships. Every available survey of happy people suggests that happy people take time to be more social. Just to show you one study on this, here's some work by Ed Diener and Marty Seligman. They do the standard thing where they find these happy folks and try to look at, what's making them happy. And in this case, they're going to be studying how these happy people spend their time. And they're going to have these folks write down their daily activities on a scale of 1 to 10. So 10 is you do this often. And they're going to compare folks who self-report being happy versus unhappy. They looked at all kinds of different daily activities, from religious exercises to exercise and so on. And they only found 2 spots where the happy folks were significantly different. One of those spots was in the amount of time spent alone, where the unhappy people are doing that more often, significantly more often than the happy folks. But the other area was when you looked at how much time people are spending with their friends and family members and loved ones, where the happy folks are doing that way more than the unhappy folks. Again, data suggesting that the simple act of hanging out with other people, especially the people you care about, is correlated at least with increasing your happiness. But can we do an intervention to show that more social connection matters? Can we actually force people to be a little bit more social and show that it improves their happiness over time? And that's just what researcher Nick Epley and his colleagues did. He, in some sense, forced his subjects to be social, and not even in the way you might expect. He forced his subjects to be social with complete strangers. He did this in the city of Chicago, which has a very famous public transport system called the L train. This is what it looks like. And so he forced people to talk to strangers on their daily commute. And so he had his subjects in 3 different conditions during this experiment. One of those conditions was the connection condition. And so in this study, he told his subjects, for the rest of the train ride, I want you to talk to someone, really try to make a connection with somebody during this train ride. In the other condition, the solitude condition, he did the opposite. He said, for the train ride, I want you to keep to yourself, enjoy your solitude, please don't talk to anyone else. And because he's a nerdy scientist like me, he also used the control condition, in which he told subjects, hey, just do what you would normally do on the train. And so Nick, though, realizes that people's minds lie to them. So in addition to sort of plotting positivity, which is the measure he's using, how positive you feel afterwards, in the actual condition, which is the one on the right, he also showed subjects this predicted condition. And so he had a different group of subjects just predict, don't actually do these events, but just predict what's going to feel better. And what he finds is that people tend to predict that the white bar, that solitude condition, will feel pretty good. The control condition will also feel pretty good. But this gray bar, the connection condition, that's not just going to be neutral. It's going to be actively bad. It's going to make you feel negative. Like talking to some stranger on the train feels kind of weird. But when subjects actually do this, Nick finds just the opposite pattern. It's that white bar, the solitude condition, that feels kind of yucky. The gray bar, the connection condition, feels actively good. And Nick finds that this result holds even for introverts. The only difference with introverts is that they even more strongly predict that the connection condition is going to feel yucky. But in practice, when introverts actually engage in these behaviors, they feel much better than they think. And so this is the power of social connection, which I feel is even more important right now during COVID-19 than ever. That normal talking to the person on the subway, that's not a thing that we can do right now in the context of social distancing. But the good news is that we have lots of other ways to connect to people, even in the context of like working from home if you need to, or staying 6 feet away from folks in public places. The great news is, in contrast to other like times of pandemics, we actually have wonderful technologies that we can use to connect with one another. Things like Zoom, which is the platform that I'm using to conduct this webinar, things like Skype, even your old fashioned phone that you can pick up and call an elderly friend or neighbor. All of these technologies allow us to connect, and they allow us to do so in real time, which is the thing that the science suggests really matters. The act of making these connections in real time can feel really powerful. And the act of making connections that are a little more informal can be really powerful. So don't just use these kinds of technologies for like, a work chat, or a work meeting. Like try to do so informally, like, connect with neighbors while you're, cooking your dinner, or do an exercise class together with somebody. All of these technologies can connect us powerfully, but we really just need to take the active steps to use them. And so that's the power of social connection. But there's other ways that building healthy relationships can be really important for our well-being during this time. And one of those is through the act of helping other people. And the research suggests that helping others actually makes us happier than we expect. And this is something that I think is not necessarily part of the cultural consciousness. We often assume that if we want to feel better, we need something like self-care, like treat yourself is a mantra that a lot of our Americans talk about culturally. But the data suggests that treating yourself doesn't work in the ways we often think, that actually doing nice things for others can make us feel better. And we know this from some lovely research by Elizabeth Dunn and her colleagues. She went up to folks on the street in North America and walked up to people and gave them money and asked them to spend it in particular ways. And so here's how her study worked. She first asked her subjects to rate their happiness. They rated happiness on a standard scale. Then the researcher gives the subjects some money. In this case, they gave subjects either $5 or $20 Canadian dollars. And then the subjects were told how to spend that money. They either had to spend that money on themselves, so doing something nice, for self-care, treat yourself, or they had to spend the money on someone else. And subjects had to agree that they'd be called later that day, and then the researchers would test how their happiness changed. Liz and her colleagues also realized, though, that people's minds lied to them. So in addition to having subjects who actually got the money and actually had to spend it on someone else, she also had a different group of subjects make predictions. Which of these would feel better? And people made predictions as you might expect. People thought that the self-care condition would feel pretty good, that spending the money on yourself would feel better than spending the money on other people. People also predicted that spending more money would feel better than spending less money. I think people thought this was kind of a stupid question. Obviously spending $20 is going to feel better than spending $5. But those are just predictions. What really happens? And the answer is that what really happens is just the opposite. What really happens is that people who spend the money on other people feel better than people who spend the money on themselves. They do so at the time that they're called, and even later again at the end of the week. Doing nice things for others just feels good. And the other thing that researchers found is that it doesn't really matter how much money people are spending. In fact, there was no difference in the magnitude of money. It seems to just be the act of doing something nice for other people. That's the kind of thing that really seems to matter over time. And so when faced with these findings that self-care isn't necessarily what we need to be doing for our own well-being is reaching out and helping other people. I think this gives us lots of hints about the way we can use this strategy during the context of the current crisis, not just to promote other relationships and do good things for people in need, but to help our own well-being. One of the ways that I've seen a lot is trying to find ways to use any financial windfalls you have to help other people. All of us, or many of us, are experiencing some financial windfalls that we don't notice. If we're the kind of person who buys, a morning coffee or even pays some money for our commute, like those are amounts of money that we're saving right now. And we could be spending those little windfalls on people who need it. For example, helping out local businesses who might close after this crisis. You could be donating your money that way or helping folks like that. But in addition to financial windfalls, many of us are experiencing some temporal windfalls like us. Even if you're unfortunately unemployed, you might have some more time on your hands. What can you be using that time for to do positive things for other people? Maybe reaching out and calling an elderly neighbor, or advocating, for folks in hospitals and trying to get them the protective equipment they need. There are all kinds of different things we could be doing to help people in need during this time. That helps our societies and helps our kind of flourishing communities, but it also can help our own individual well-being as well. And so that's the first thing that really matters, is that we need to be focused on social connections and healthy relationships. The data suggests they're really powerful, maybe even especially more powerful in the context of this coronavirus crisis. So now we'll jump on to what really matters, part two. And that is that if we really want to be like happy people, we should find positive strategies for dealing with daily stress and anxiety. And I think this is generally true, but it is particularly true in the context of COVID-19, when our stress levels, and particularly our anxiety levels in some cases, are really through the roof. Dealing with this pandemic is one that can really spike our fear and our panic, and just our uncertainty about the situation. And so the question is, the idea is that we should be doing something about that, because that will make us obviously feel better. The question is what we can do. And of course, science has a couple really great strategies. One of those strategies is that we should try to regulate the amount that our mind is wandering. And what is mind wandering? Well, here is my favorite physical representation of it. Mind wandering is just the act of kind of ruminating about stuff that's not experiencing the here and now. So thinking about, what you're going to make for dinner tonight, or what's going to happen with your job, or when is this pandemic going to be over? You're thinking about things that are not in the here and now. And it turns out that the mere act of doing that, the mere act of thinking about stuff like that, actually reduces our happiness. We know that from some lovely work by Matt Killingsworth and Dan Gilbert and colleagues. They did this lovely study where they gave people a little cell phone app that pinged them at random times of day. And it asked them a couple different questions. It asked people, how are you feeling? They asked people, what are you doing right now? Are you paying attention to what you're doing? And how are you feeling? And when Gilbert and colleagues do this, they find that people self-report they're not paying attention to what they're doing a lot of the time. In fact, just under 50% of the time, people are simply not paying attention to what's going on. Their minds are wandering, which is kind of philosophically bad, that we're kind of not paying attention to our life generally. But it also has a huge well-being hit. As I mentioned, these researchers also asked, how are you feeling? And what they find when they have people self-report their feelings on a scale from 0 to 100, where 100 is quite good, is that mind wandering feels kind of yucky. Again, if you can see my cursor, the first dot over there is the unpleasant mind wandering condition. So that's when you self-report that you're thinking about stuff that's not really that nice. You're thinking about a fight you had with your spouse, or the fact that that we're going to get stuck inside for a really long time. When you're not thinking about the here and now, about unpleasant stuff, that feels kind of yucky. But even when you're thinking about neutral things, what should I make for dinner tonight? Or even pleasant mind wandering, thinking about, where you're going to go when the pandemic's over and so on. All of those are simply not as good as this act of not mind wandering at all. The act of just being present in your own body feels better than any form of mind wandering, which raises this question, which is, okay, if mind wandering feels bad, how can we stop it? How can we use that to rein in our stress, to rein in our anxiety, and so on? And there's a couple different techniques. One is a technique that we talked about in the context of hedonic adaptation, which is just the mere act of savoring. The way savoring works and the way it breaks your hedonic adaptation is to just focus you on the things that are happening in the moment. So if you're enjoying this experience of eating a nice ice cream cone, you could think about, what does this taste like? What does this feel like? What does this smell like? How would I describe this experience to somebody? It's the act of being fully present in the experiences that we're enjoying in any one given moment. And it can be incredibly powerful for reducing our mind wandering, because it brings our brain there. We're like actively paying attention. And just the act of doing so, putting ourselves in the present moment, reduces mind wandering and can make us feel a little happier. So savoring is a technique that we can enjoy in the moment, But there are other techniques that we can use to build up our presence and our lack of mind wandering over time. And that is this phenomena of meditation, and particularly the processes that are involved in mindfulness meditation in particular. And so mindfulness is a practice that's receiving a ton of psychological research right now, even though it is pretty much an ancient tradition. And so just to kind of walk through what mindfulness is, it's a part of a whole system of practices that were done in ancient traditions that involve things like meditation and so on. But the key feature is that there are two parts of doing mindfulness in some sense right. One of the parts is that you have to be taking a sort of particular way of being around the world. And that is a way of being that involves attention to the present moment. You are committing to focus your attention on what's happening in the here and now, whether that's your breath, part of your body, a mantra, like you're sticking your attention on something in the here and now. But there's a second part, which is a certain attitudinal part. It's not just what you're doing in terms of your attention, it's the attitude that you're going to take towards this process. And the attitude is an attitude of acceptance. And so we have Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's a real practitioner of mindfulness meditation, and he has a lovely definition. He notes that mindfulness means paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. So you're very intentionally using your attention to pay attention to the present moment, and you're doing so without judgment. And so the reason that mindfulness, and this is just a bit of a joke, which is if you're a fan of 1960s music like the Beatles, you can sort of sum up all of Jon Kabat-Zinn's points by saying that what mindfulness is doing is you're just going to let it be. You're going to pay attention and let it be. That is the non-judgment part. But the reason mindfulness works is that it's a technique that allows us to change the defaults of our brain, which can be incredibly powerful. And to understand this, we're going to do a kind of very quick dive into the way our brain works. It turns out our brain, like lots of good systems, has its own autopilot. And its own autopilot is this region that neuroscientists refer to as the default mode network. That's whenever you're not putting work into whatever you're thinking about, the network of regions of your brains that come on. These are where they are in the brain. You don't need to know that, but basically those are the things that come on when you're not really putting any work in. And often what that means is that those are the parts of your brain that allow you to mind wander. Like those are the parts of the brain that are going to be thinking about what you're going to have for dinner or ruminating about what's happening in COVID-19 and so on. And so the key from the perspective of well-being is we should be finding ways to shut these parts of our brain off, if at all possible. And that, it turns out, is what meditation does scientifically. And so we know this from some work by Judson Brewer and his colleagues who looked at the neuroscientific activity of meditators versus control individuals. And he used a couple different kinds of meditation. It kind of doesn't matter which one, but basically he looked at not when individuals were meditating, but just generally when individuals were sitting around, do people who are expert meditators show less default brain activity? In other words, are their brains autopilots just on less often? And I'll show you the results of his study. He looked at two different parts of this so-called default mode network. But in both of these regions, when you look at the signal change, so bigger bars are kind of more activation, controls across these three different kinds of meditations are showing more activation than the meditators. In other words, the meditators in both of these cases are actually decreasing their activation in these regions. What does that mean? It's kind of a thick neuroscience story, but basically what it's showing you is that meditation has actually shut off the automatic processes in our brain that tend to allow us to mind wander. And the practice of meditation is doing that not just in the context of meditation, but afterwards, just in our daily lives. So rather than ruminating when we're at dinner and our partner is talking to us, we can actually pay attention a little bit more through this practice of meditation. And I think that the fact that mindfulness is so powerful is especially important during the time of COVID-19 and makes meditation an especially helpful technique during this time, in part because it's a way that we can shut off the kind of rumination and anxiety that we would typically have during this situation and bring our minds on topic to something that we really want to be focused on that might be more positive to focus on during this time. And there's also a particular kind of meditation that I find especially important right now. As I said, mindfulness practices can be used to focus on a bunch of different things, but there's one form of meditation known as loving kindness meditation, where what you focus on is is compassion. What you focus on is wishing the people in your life well. So you direct kindness to yourself. You sort of have the thought of, may I be happy. You direct kindness to your friends and family members, like, may my mother be happy, may my father be happy, and so on. Or even to just everyone in the world, may my community be happy, may the UAE be happy, may the world be happy, and so on. And you focus through this meditation practice on what that feels like. The reason this meditation technique is so powerful is that it increases the emotion of compassion, which I think can be incredibly important during the time of COVID-19, where we want to be kind of putting our efforts towards feeling like we can help the other people around us, and even extending ourselves a little of compassion, that it's okay to kind of feel so stressed, and that we just need to kind of not beat ourselves up and sort of do the best that we can. And so meditation and this practice of mindfulness can be incredibly powerful for decreasing our stress and anxiety. But another tip I wanted to give, which is kind of even more the kind of thing you can do in the moment than, say, a long-term meditation practice, is to try to find ways to calm your sympathetic nervous system during this trying time. And I think this is especially important during COVID-19. What's the sympathetic nervous system? Well, that is our so-called fight or flight response. The sympathetic nervous system is the part of our autonomic nervous system that's worried about threats, that makes us get ready to kind of fight that threat or to run away. And it does so through shifting the kind of preferences that our body is given to certain things. It bumps up our heart rate so that our heart is beating really fast. It kind of moves the blood away from our skin. That's why we get this sort of pale, flushed skin. Our pupils dilate so we can pay attention to what's going on, and we start to tremble. Usually the fight or flight system is only activated really briefly if, say, a lion was jumping out to get us. But we sometimes end up activating our fight or flight systems quite chronically. So chronically, in fact, that we're kind of using them all the time, which is quite bad because it means we're not devoting energy to things like our immune system, which we need right now. And it leads to long-term physical consequences like a tight chest and tension headaches and all this kind of yucky stuff. And so what we need to do is to find ways to regulate our sympathetic nervous system, this fight or flight response. And the good news is that research gives us a really easy way to do it, which is just to turn on the other part of our nervous system, the so-called rest and digest parasympathetic nervous system. What that system does is it kind of decreases the activity in the other one. They're kind of like a push and pull sort of measure. And we can kind of get rid of that fight or flight response. And the awesome thing is that our body gives us a very easy way to do this, which is just through the use of our breath. The act of taking really slow, deep breaths in, particularly in our belly, where we're kind of inhaling deeply and making sure our belly is actually popping out, can be incredibly powerful. And this can be incredibly powerful technique because deep belly breathing activates the vagus nerve. It basically is shutting down our fight or flight system and leaving us a little bit calmer because of it. And of course, in the context of COVID-19, this can be incredibly powerful if you're feeling panicked, if you're feeling stressed, if you're feeling like you just need to calm down your fight or flight. Just take a few minutes every day to do a couple of these deep belly breaths. And what that will do is calm down your sympathetic nervous system so your rest and digest can take back over. And so that is how you can deal with your sympathetic nervous system. But I'll talk finally about in this section about how I think you can deal with some of your fear and anxiety. And this gets back to the kinds of things we were talking about before, but applying them specifically to this anxiety we're all feeling right now, the fear of when is this going to be over? Am I going to get sick? Is someone I care about going to suffer? And so on. And it comes back to these practices of mindful meditation, and in particular, one that harnesses what meditation researcher Tara Brach calls her acronym of RAIN. RAIN is an acronym that stands for 4 processes that you can use to regulate your emotions. The R in the acronym of RAIN is to focus on and recognize what is happening. That's what the R is for. So if you're feeling kind of fear and anxiety, you're kind of panicked, from reading the news or something, first take a moment to recognize, wait a minute, that feeling in my chest, all that stuff, that's panic. That's what fear feels like. I'm going to recognize that. Then the hard step is that you allow that feeling to be there. Can you just sit with it, however it feels, and just let it be, rather than fight it, rather than try to deal with it, just like feel what it feels like and let it be there. And then you turn on your sort of nerdy scientist hat with the I there, and then you begin to investigate. Investigate, what does it feel like? Like, when I feel really fear, it tightens my chest. Or that's what makes my kind of forehead feel a little tense. Like, you actually do the work to investigate it like a scientist would, to kind of feel what it really feels like. And that helps you notice what these things are. And then we get to the N, which is the sort of self-compassion part where you really nurture this feeling. Can you sit with this and be like, I'm sorry, this sucks that you're feeling fear right now, but let me just kind of be with it and sort of, feel that it's okay. Research has shown that this process of kind of mindfully being with our emotions, this kind of non-judgmentally investigating them and accepting them, can be incredibly powerful, even for the strong negative emotions we're feeling in the context of this crisis. And of course, applying these principles of RAIN during COVID-19 can not only help you feel a little bit better, but they can help you regulate the kind of panic that a lot of us are feeling right now. And it can be a way to regulate that panic in a way that's kind of a little bit more self-compassionate. And so that's what really matters too. If we want to be happier, we need to deal with our stress and anxiety. And hopefully those are giving you some tools to do it. Now we're going to jump to what really matters, part 3, which is something that's become even more essential during the time of COVID-19, which is that if we want to be like happy people, we're going to need some strategies for managing and balancing our digital life. I don't need to explain to you that much of our life has gone online lately and has been important online lately. But the question is how these different online activities, from social media to just using our phone, are really affecting our happiness. And we need to know that in part because these kinds of technologies have skyrocketed in terms of how much people are using them. Here's just one graph from the US, and it's actually kind of outdated graph. It's from about 4 years ago. But here's the huge shooting up of use of social media by different ages. And I put this up there to note that this isn't just a problem for our young people. These are the kinds of things that we're seeing in even older individuals. Like more and more individuals are using social media all the time. But that raises the question of whether or not social media is actually making us happier. Is it really good for us that we're using these things? Well, there's lots of different studies out there, but there's some hints that these things are not making us as happy as we think. And one comes from this recent study that looked at Facebook use and had people make some predictions, like predict how you're going to feel after being on Facebook for about 20 minutes. And so they gave subjects a way to predict, do you predict that you're going to be better than before? Or do you predict that you're going to feel worse than before? That's what people are asked. But then what you find is that people's predicted feeling is that Facebook, it's not going to make you feel fantastic, but it's going to kind of bump you up from that middle range of 5. Overall, it'll make you feel a little good, but actually it doesn't make us feel as good as we think. We're kind of over predicting that it's going to make us feel good, but in practice, it doesn't make us feel that great. And there are some hints that Facebook and other social media sites are making us feel, actively not good. In fact, the same study actually looked at whether or not more Facebook activity increased your mood. And the way they did that was they used a little link through Facebook where they asked folks, hey, how long have you been on Facebook right now? So people would be like, I was just doing a quick check, or I've been on for a half hour. And then they asked, hey, what's your mood? Using a standard mood scale known as PANAS. And what they find is that there seems to be a correlation between the amount of time you're spending on Facebook and your mood, but it's a negative correlation. What does that mean? That means the more time you're spending on Facebook, the worse you report your mood to be, which is not really that great. But it's not just Facebook. There's evidence suggesting that lots of the time that lots of different social media sites are also kind of making us overall, in general, when you look at the costs and benefits, not making us feel as good as we'd like to think. And one of my favorite studies from this comes from the Royal Society that actually looked at a bunch of different social media platforms. I'll show you the data just for 2, but they actually put together a survey that tried to tap into all kinds of different feelings about these social media sites, like whether they were increasing your awareness of health stuff, because that's what the Royal Society cares about, emotional support, anxiety, depression, loneliness, sleep, and then even gone on to look at self-expression, body image, community building. And number 14, which I think is important, FOMO, this fear that you're missing out. And then they made these lovely graphs for each different social media site. Here's just the one for Snapchat, about cases where these different things were kind of moving in the positive direction. So for Snapchat, you do get some emotional support and you get some self-expression. Those are good things. Or the negative direction, like Snapchat's increasing anxiety, depression, loneliness, sleep, and so on. And then for each social media site, they made an average weighted score of the positives and negatives. That's the one for Snapchat. En masse, it's slightly negative. And same for Instagram. If you're an Instagram fan, big increases in FOMO and anxiety, big reductions in sleep, which is bad for well-being. These things aren't doing the stuff we think, which caused a recent Institute of Labor Economics report to conclude that spending 1 hour per day on social media extra reduces your probability of being completely satisfied with your life by about 14 percentage points, which is pretty bad. And so it's worth noting, though, that the technology decreases we get from social media aren't just a problem with social media. In fact, there's research suggesting that just the mere act of using our phone can be hurting our well-being in ways that we don't expect. In fact, there's some studies suggesting that having your phone around you during happy events, like a nice massage, or even when you're playing video games like Mario Kart, can reduce your enjoyment of those activities, which is really interesting and sad. And so it raises this question of like, why are phones doing that? Like, what's the mechanism scientifically by which they're hurting our happiness? And I'll mention just a couple. One of them is that phones in general, and in particular with social media, seem to be affecting what I'll call our attentional hygiene. And that just means that to enjoy the stuff in the world, we have to attend to them. Our attention is really limited. If we want to taste a delicious meal we're having, we need to be there. We need to be present and mindful and pay attention to it. And what phones often do, if we're using them, of course, is that they steal our attention. It means we can't be mindful about, say, the taste of the pizza we're eating if we're on our phone. But the research is starting to show that phones are dragging our attention away even when we're not using them. Even their mere presence can be messing with our attention and therefore our enjoyment of different activities. And one study by Adrian Ward and his colleagues looked at this. They just asked whether the mere presence of your phone was enough to mess up your attention on performance in different kinds of tasks. They had college students do an IQ test and a memory test when their phones were in different locations. So your phone could either be right there with you at the table where you're doing the test, it could be away in your bag where you couldn't see it, or it could be off in a different room. And the question is, what does your performance look like on different tests? And so here's just one measure they did on working memory performance. When your phone is with you at your desk, that's your score on the working memory test. When it's in your pocket or your bag, so you just don't see it, you do a little bit better. But when your phone is off in your other room and it's not stealing your attention at all, you do much better. And this is really scary because this is just having your phone near you. You're not even allowed to use it. It's just off on your desk, but it's still affecting your performance. And so I think we need to worry about the attentional hygiene with which our phones are affecting us. But we also need to worry about the way, particularly social media, can allow us to increase our social comparison. And this is one of the reasons I think that social media makes us feel especially sad. What is social comparison? Well, I love this quote by the historian Charles de Montesquieu. He notes, if only we wanted to be happy, it would be easier. But we want to be happier than other people, which is almost always difficult because we think that they're happier than they are. Basically, what he's saying is that social comparison hurts us because we assume that everyone else's life is fantastic out there, and we're not even comparing ourselves to an accurate standard. And just to see the power of this, I love this study by Jordan et al. This study looked at how college students estimate the experience of their friends. So they asked college freshmen to estimate how many of their college peers had good and bad experiences. But then they also had these college students write how many bad experiences they themselves had. So that could allow them to get a predicted estimate and another estimate. And the question is, do these match up? In other words, when you're comparing yourself against other people, are you even doing it accurately? And that's just what they looked at across a bunch of different estimated activities. So how many other individuals attended a fun party? People think, oh, 60% do. How many went to a good athletic game, went out with their friends, had a great meal, received a high grade? Those are what people predict, but what actually happens is almost always less than what people think. In other words, the real way that people are spending their time isn't nearly as good as we think other people are spending their time. That's for the positive things, but the researchers got even bigger effects when they looked at negative things. So how often do you think another peer at college had a fight with their roommate, or thought about missing friends, or worried about their workload, or was rejected by someone, or thought about their own bad habits, or received a low grade, and so on? That's what people estimate. But what actually happens is always not just bigger, but like often way bigger. We don't realize how much other people are missing their friends or worried about their workload and so on. And the reason we don't realize this, as Jordan et al. Found, is that people are actively hiding their negative emotions from others, especially on social media. So when you ask people, how often do you actively hide the fact that you're experiencing negative emotions? Whether you had a fight with your roommate, oh, that's pretty often. Thought about missing people, worried about your workload, was rejected, thought about your bad habits, got a low grade. The idea is that people aren't advertising when they're going through bad stuff. And so social comparison can be particularly problematic because we're not even comparing ourselves against an accurate standard, which is really quite bad. And so how do we improve our digital habits? Well, it comes back to the advice that we gave a little bit before, which is that this is another domain in which we want to practice mindfulness. We need to pay attention to the emotions we're experiencing when we're using our phone. We need to notice how good and bad we feel after we get on social media. We need to notice how it's doing to our sleep. We need to notice what it's doing to our emotions. This act of being a little bit more mindful can be the first step to realize we need a different relationship with our phone. And then once we realize that, we can harness the tools that we need to get our attentional hygiene back, so we can shut off those notifications. We can put our phone away when we want to be hanging out with friends and really be paying attention. Active steps that we can take to improve our digital hygiene. And so through this practice of mindfulness, I think is especially important during the context of COVID-19, where many of us are feeling anxious in part because we're using social media. We're kind of panic scrolling through scary things on the internet all the time. If you take time to be mindful and notice how those digital habits are making you feel, it can cause you to realize whether or not you need to shift some of them around a little bit. And that can be incredibly powerful normally, but especially powerful during this anxiety-provoking time. And I should note also that we can then use our digital habits more positively, rather than sort of scrolling an anxiety-producing social media feed, making social connections across the way with friends through technologies like Zoom and so on. And really noticing, again, as I mentioned about the panic scrolling, what it feels like when you're not making these in real life connections, what it feels like if you're just, scrolling through a social feed and so on. Is that making you feel as good as you could be using the technology to make you feel? Paying attention to this stuff can be really, really powerful. Okay, so that was what really matters 3. Now we're going to jump to the final thing I'm going to talk about that really matters for your happiness. And that is about our time. If we want to be happy, we need to manage our time in an efficient way. And I think this can be incredibly powerful in the current situation that we find ourselves in, but also just in modern life in general. Many of us feel like our time is kind of slipping away. Many of us feel what researchers call time famine, where we literally feel famished and hungry for time because we don't have enough of it. What's ironic about our time famine is that researchers suggest that we're actually we actually have more time now than we ever have in a long time. We actually have more time than we realize. The problem is that that time is broken up into what researchers like Ashley Willens call time confetti. So the time is kind of broken up into these tiny moments, and we never really have big stretches of time that we can enjoy. And the feeling is that we never have enough, even though we actually have more. And so the research suggests that we can do better and use time to improve our happiness if we focus on a different kind of subjective feeling of our time, which is to find ways to promote what's called time affluence. Time affluence is the opposite of time famine. It's this subjective sense that we have a lot of free time, that your schedule is not super packed, that you have some time to say, lounge around in the grass if you wanted to, or just some free time to do what you need to. The research suggests that people who prioritize time affluence tend to be a little happier than the folks who don't, especially the folks who are kind of using their time to go after money. You'd be much happier if you're freeing up some of that time. And here's just one study by Ashley Willens and colleagues that shows this quite directly. Ashley asks, who are you more like in this picture? Are you more like the guy on the left who's chasing after the money, where you're kind of constantly chasing after money and you don't, always giving up your time to do so, so you'll work more hours at work and so on? Or are you like the guy on the right who's constantly chasing after time? You forego some money to get a little extra time, and you really prioritize time in your life. What Ashley finds is that the folks who chase after money are actually less happy than the folks who chase after time. So prioritizing your time could actually be a really big boost for your well-being. This is out of a 5-point scale, so those are actually pretty significant differences. But then that raises a question, which is that why does time affluence really help us? Well, it helps us because it allows us to engage in behaviors that are really positive for our well-being. One of those behaviors is just social behaviors. When will you engage in more social contact with other people? Well, if you have time. If you're super booked at work or booked with a project and you just can't squeeze in any time, it doesn't feel really good to socialize. And so the research suggests that time affluence, the feeling of time affluence, can actually bump up your social connection, which, as we saw, is really essential for the healthy relationships we need to be happier. Just to show one study about this, this is by Mogliner and colleagues. They actually didn't necessarily give people more time affluence. They just kind of did a little priming exercise. So they go up to people in a cafe and they have them think about either how much time they have or how much money they have, by unscrambling words. So this just kind of just gets people in their head of like, oh, time's super important. Oh yeah, money's super important. So they do either time or money with the group of subjects. And then they just kind of secretly watch how people spend their time in the cafe. And then they test their happiness afterwards. And then what these researchers find is that if you look at the people who are primed with time versus money versus the control, who didn't get any of those little word scrambling things, the ones who are primed with time end up working less than the ones who are primed with money. It's pretty hard to see with the graphic here, but this is the bar for money. So if you're primed with money, then you keep working more and more. You spend more of your time in the cafe working. Whereas if you look at the amount of time people spend socializing, the people who are thinking more about time end up doing that more. What does that mean? That means just the mere act of sort of focusing a little bit on time and how much you have and so on, it can actually allow you to feel like you have more time and feel a little bit more social. You actually show this in the real world. And of course, as you might guess, this actually maps onto people's happiness. So if you look at the happiness rating across these conditions, that's the happiness rating out of a 5-point scale for the controls. That's for the money, and for the time it actually goes up. So thinking about and feeling like you have a little bit of extra free time can bump up your happiness. And the reason it does so, we think, is that thinking about your time is making you happier, in part because it's making you more social. But having a good sense of time affluence can also promote two other behaviors that I know are super important for the programming of the School of Life, and that we know increases your happiness. So having a little bit more time affluence means you feel like you can get to the gym, or you can squeeze in a quick yoga class. And this can have huge effects on happiness. There's research suggesting that taking a half hour to do some cardio exercise can be as effective as a prescription of Zoloft to reduce your depression symptoms. So exercise is having a much more profound effect on our well-being than we think. But there's another thing that we get from having a little extra time, which is that we can promote our sleep habits. And sleep is obviously very important for our physical health, but it can be incredibly important for our mental health, even though we don't realize. And so my students who come in so sleepy are doing that to hurt their kind of sleep schedule, but they're also hurting their mental health. And we know that from a study by Dinges and colleagues. Dinges actually surveyed subjects' moods at different levels of sleep. So they had their subjects first do amount of normal sleep. Normal, by the way, what we should be getting is around 7 to 8 hours a night. So hopefully you're all getting that there. But normal sleep for 2 hours, normal sleep for 2 days is what their subjects got. Then they deprived their subjects of sleep. So their subjects only got 5 hours of sleep for 7 days. And then subjects were allowed to go back to normal levels of sleep. And the researchers were interested in what happened to subjects' mood. And so I'm going to plot for you what's called a POMS vigor, which is basically a profile of mood score. Higher numbers are higher moods, and moods at the lower end of the scale, when you're down near the bottom, they're basically moods that are pretty bad. They look like you have clinical depression. And here's what happens after a single week of restricted or deprived sleep. At first, normal subjects are in a good mood, then they start restricting their sleep and their mood just tanks. Luckily, the good news is that you can bump your mood back up just by returning to your sleep. And so this is pretty critical. We need time affluence, not just because time alone makes us feel good, but because time and managing it appropriately can allow us to engage in habits that we know are great for our well-being. Things like socializing more, making time for exercise, and very importantly, making time for sleep. And I think that this is all incredibly critical and kind of a little bit different during this time of COVID-19, because many of us are having a little bit of a different relationship with time than we did before. I think some of us are feeling even more frantic for time. You know, if you have kids at home for the first time and you're kind of babysitting and running a school and working, you can feel even more time famished than ever before. But some of us are actually experiencing a little burst of time affluence that we didn't expect. And I think it's really critical to use that time in appropriate ways. One of the things we should be doing is to try to promote our exercise during this time. Again, a great way to promote mental health, but also a wonderful way to kind of bump up our immune system. Some of us are unable to do that by walking around outside or going for a jog because of social distancing. But of course, it's worth remembering that we have lots of different technology tools that can allow us to do this well. There are tons of different free yoga classes online or HIIT classes. I think most exercise places in the world are kind of giving a lot of free content out right now. You know, so if you just have enough space in your house for a yoga mat, you can engage in these activities and you can use your time affluence to do that. But most importantly, I think in the time of COVID-19, we need to be focusing on our sleep, in part because the kind of anxiety and the panic we're feeling can sometimes reduce our access to good sleep. And so we need to be focused on really good sleep hygiene during this time. One of the things I've talked about with other folks is this kind of panic scrolling. We talked about that in the mindfulness section, that we need to notice how it makes us feel. Often if you notice how it's making you feel, it actually makes you feel kind of crummy, like it actually makes you can feel more panic and more anxious, especially if you do it right before bed. And so one of the sleep tips that I've been giving the folks that I talk to and my students is to see if you can move around your news scrolling. Again, we have a 24-hour news cycle, but you don't have to be on it 24 hours a day. You know, if you can just allow yourself to get your news fixes in the morning when you're a little bit more alert, maybe you can protect that time right before you go to bed and allow yourself not to have any technology, then this is a way to kind of manage our digital lives, but also to use our time effectively so that we can use our time appropriately to get enough sleep when we need it. And so that is what really matters for happiness part 4, is that we need to be focused on ways that we can manage and be efficient in our time. We need to do that generally, but I think we need to take special care to do that well during the time of COVID-19. Okay, so those were your 4 things that really matter for happiness. We kind of cruised through them. It was a little bit of a long haul, but I hope it gave you some important tips for how you can do better. But now, before we turn to the questions that you've all sent in, I just wanted to end kind of this sort of arc of the story of how I got involved with the School of Life, kind of where it began, because the story of my involvement in the science of well-being is really a story about finding ways to change the culture of stress. And that mission started at Yale, but now, as you see here, now that I'm talking to all of you all in the UAE, it's gone well beyond that. What started with this class that went viral on campus really went viral off campus. And it led me to realize that people really need these skills to improve their well-being generally. And I feel like that's incredibly more important during the time of COVID-19, when we all, even if we were doing good at focusing on our well-being before, we need to be reminded of ways we can do that. And the ways we've been trying to help with that is not to just give this content on campus, but to kind of try to share this content as widely as possible. And so in addition to this video, which I hope you'll be able to check out and use over time as part of the School of Life, we also started an online course called The Science of Wellbeing that learners around the world can take on Coursera.org. I'll sort of give the URL at the end of this. Basically, this is just a short version of the entire class that students get at Yale. So if this hour and a half wasn't enough for you, there's still more content out there that you can jump into on Coursera.org. And just to get a sense that a lot of people in the world need this, we've recently, especially during the coronavirus crisis, bumped up a lot. We've actually had over 1 million learners sign up just in the last month. And we're now up to 2 million people around the world who are taking this Coursera class and learning what they can do to focus on being happier. And just so you can see how worldwide this phenomena is, I know I've given you a lot of data from the US, but the folks who are taking this class are not just from the US. We actually have folks around the world who are jumping in on this content, which is really quite incredible. But in addition, if you want like sort of shorter bursts of some tips for what you can do to feel happier, particularly in a time of COVID-19, I wanted to give a little reminder about our podcast, which is called The Happiness Lab. In the podcast, we do these quick, half hour, 20-minute episodes on what you can do to feel happier. And we have a whole special season right now specifically devoted to the coronavirus, what you can do to increase calm during this time, what you can do to change your mindset, and also what you can do to focus on helping others. Lots and lots of episodes. We're trying to release 2 episodes a week to give people as much content on what they can do to stay happy as possible. So do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to the Happiness Lab. But with that, again, I think the goal of this conversation and the goal of the School of Life generally is to recognize that we can change the culture of stress and sad moods and all the things that make us less satisfied with our lives through understanding what the science tells us. We can really change the culture of stress, again, not just on my own Yale campus, but beyond. And I hope I've done that a little bit here today. I hope that I've given you kind of a bit of a path to happiness. You've sort of seen what you need to do, but now this is where the hard work really starts. This is where, when we talked about the difference between the science of happiness and the practice of happiness, now is when the practice needs to start. You know the kinds of things you need to do, but you need to put those habits into practice. You need to do a little bit more work to make these things part of your life. And that might take a little bit more energy right now in the context of coronavirus than it did before. The good news is that if you can hop on that path to happiness, you'll reap incredible benefits, because happiness will not just make you feel better, it can help your immune system too. So even as you're doing it just to kind of protect yourself against coronavirus, this can be just another step that you're taking to make you and your family a little bit safer, but also a little bit happier. And so with that, I'll express my gratitude to all the folks who helped make this happen. And I'm going to hop off my screen share. I'll see if I can make this work for a second. And so that I think you're just seeing me right now, so that I can answer some of the questions that you've put through here. One of the things I was most excited about doing this live session is that the School of Life was kind enough to solicit questions ahead of time so that I could sort of see what you all were thinking about and sort of recognize what you wanted to learn more about. And so now I'm just going to take a quick sip of water. So I've been talking for an hour and a half, and then we're going to dig in on some questions. And so the first set of questions I wanted to tackle are questions specifically about the this time during the coronavirus pandemic and the sorts of things we can do to feel a little bit better. I mean, you heard some about those before. But one of the questions that I really wanted to focus in on was one by Rizwan, who asked, can you share some tips on survival during lockdown and how to control our mind? I think you've seen some of these before in terms of the context of mindfulness and so on. But one of the biggest strategies I've heard about thinking about controlling your mind actually comes back from the Stoics. We talked a little bit about the Stoics already in the context of negative visualization. But the Stoics had a distinction that I think is incredibly powerful for what we can do to control our mind during this time. The Stoics said we should recognize that there are kind of two things in the world, the things we can control and the things we can't. And in the context of coronavirus, there's a lot of stuff that we cannot control right now. We can't control the virus and how bad it's spreading, and we can't control when it's going to get better and when we can leave our houses. There's suffering that we often can't control. Sometimes if relatives of ours are sick, we can't even intervene. So it can feel like there's a lot that we cannot control, but there's also a lot that we can. And you've learned some of these tips before. We can control our mindset. You can control even your emotions. You can regulate them and accept them. You can control your attitude towards this. Are you searching for blessings and looking for times when you can experience gratitude? Or are you kind of focused on the bad stuff? And I think recognizing that control is yours for the taking, even in the context of this pandemic. At least for me, this has made me feel incredibly powerful. I know I've really valued having things that I can do in this scary time to control my physical health, right? I can wash my hands, I can socially distance. Now you've just learned tons of things that you can control about your own mental health. And the key is that by putting those things into practice, you can wind up feeling a lot better. And so I think this idea of recognizing what you can control and recognizing what you can't can be an incredibly powerful ancient metaphor during this time. Another ancient metaphor I'll bring up, which is also one that's really helped me during this time, actually comes not from the Stoics, but from Buddhist tradition. It comes from a story that the Buddha allegedly had with his followers, where Buddha was once talking to his followers and asked, about what he called the parable of the second arrow. And so the parable of the second arrow goes something like this. Buddha was talking with his followers and asked, is it really bad if you're hit by an arrow while you're walking down the street? And Buddhist followers said, yeah, that seems really bad to get randomly hit with an arrow. It seems like it'd be painful and so on. The Buddha said, well, would it be worse than getting hit with just one arrow if you were hit with a second arrow on top of that, like another arrow hits you too? And the follower said, yeah, getting hit with a second arrow would be a lot worse. That, definitely don't get that. So Buddha goes on to explain, the first arrow is often not in our control. Those are the circumstances in life. That's, if this virus is peaking, if we're stuck in our houses, if we happen to get sick, we can't control that. But the thing we can control is the second arrow. And Buddha says that the second arrow is our reactions to the bad stuff. That's, if we deal with this crisis by like panic scrolling and freaking out, or if we get mad at our kids, or if we just look on the downside all the time. Like the claim is that what psychology teaches us is that we can control that second arrow. There's a lot of things we can do to feel better. And in some sense, if we don't do it, that's kind of on us. And so it's a wonderful parable because it shows us, again, the kinds of things we can control and the fact that even some of the bad stuff is on us to control because we actually have an active way to feel better if we do some of these techniques. So that was one question about coronavirus specifically. Then there were a lot of questions kind of generally about what we can do to be happy, and in particularly what we can do to be happy during this time. And Sophia asked one that I really like. She asks, how do we keep up with our routines and stay positive during these times? One of the reasons I liked Sophia's question is that she mentions this process of routines, which is something that we haven't yet talked about in the context of this School of Life lesson, but can be incredibly powerful. We as humans are creatures of habit. Habits allow us to reduce the uncertainty in our world because they mean that when we have a habit, we don't really have to think about what we're going to do. Think about our daily life before, this crisis. Many of us got up and, we showered and then we went to work and then we came home from work. Like they're just things that we do in our day that are routine that really reduce the uncertainty of life. It kind of makes life a little less anxiety provoking because we kind of know what we're going to do. One of the reasons this crisis is so scary is that our normal routines have been a little bit upended. Some of us, especially if we're not working, might not have even routines anymore. Even if we are working, we might have like kind of a weird routine because our kids are there and so on. What the research suggests is that you can really reduce your anxiety during this time if you find ways to kind of build in routine even when it's not there before. So if you have kids at home, pretend that at school, set a day, even if the kids are kind of not doing anything, if they're kind of playing video games or coloring or playing with their toys, set specific times that they're going to do that. From 9 to 10 is breakfast, then from 10 to whatever, 1 o'clock is playing with your toys, whatever, what have you. The idea of building in routine is actually one way to stay positive during the coronavirus. And I think the way you do it, as Sophia nicely asked, is you just kind of set it up. Get down either on a whiteboard or something you can scribble on where your family can see it, and write what the times of the day are going to be, almost like a little schedule for yourself. And then just having that schedule can be incredibly powerful because it can allow us to stick with stuff over time. And so one of the coronavirus tips is whatever you can do to build yourself a schedule can be really quite powerful. So that was Sophia's question. Another question is in general about kind of happiness and emotion, I think in general, but also during the time of coronavirus. And this is Iman's question. He asks, shall we be happy all the time, or is it also necessary to feel sad too? What's the right ratio between happiness and sadness? I think, this is a question I get a lot. First of all, just should we have negative emotions at all? And the answer, I think, is yes. Our emotions are tools. They're there to teach us things. Our sadness is telling us, what we're missing in life and what we might need to change, or it's allowing us to recognize and appreciate the things that were there. And same thing for our fear. I think fear is scary right now, but it's also critical to have a little bit. I watch kind of with horror those images of the folks on spring break who are partying and seem to not have enough fear. I kind of wish those folks could kind of up their fear a little bit. But I think in general, we need to recognize that our emotions are tools. We don't really want to shut them off, but we do want to regulate them and find ways to accept them, because when we push them away, that's when things get kind of nasty. When we try to pretend that we're not afraid, that's when their fear starts affecting our sleep and so on. When we try to pretend that we're not angry or sad, that's what it's going to seep in when we least want it or least expect it. And so I think there's not really a perfect ratio between happy emotions and sad emotions. But if you personally feel like your ratio of sad emotions is getting a little bit too high, then that's where you need to jump into some strategies where you can emotionally regulate. And I think today we've talked about a lot of such strategies, this process of mindfulness, that acronym of RAIN that I talked about, where you recognize your emotions, accept them, kind of investigate them and get a sense, and then kind of just nurture yourself and nurture them there. Those are all powerful techniques for kind of being with your emotions, not shutting them off, but allowing them to be there and accepting them. And that can be incredibly powerful. Another question that we got, there's a lot of questions about relationships, which I quite like because it's especially important for the School of Life. I think if you subscribe to more of their content, you'll hear a lot more about what you can do to promote healthy relationships. But Menahel asks, how do you control overwhelming fear of not being good enough, either for people, for other situations, or just all the time? And the first thing I wanted to do is just to validate Menahel's point. I get it totally. A lot of us experience what can be known as imposter syndrome, just this sense that we're kind of just not good enough, that we're not living up to our expectations, that we're not good enough at our work, or that we're not good enough in our relationships. And oftentimes it's not because we're doing anything bad. It's really just because we're kind of beating ourselves up a lot. In some ways, we can be our worst critic a lot of the time. And that's why I like kind of going back to this parable of the second arrow. It's one thing to, maybe feel like you're not good enough, but it's another to kind of hit yourself with that second arrow of really feeling like you're not good enough all the time. A lot of time that's not on the people you're around or your other people in your relationships. It's really on you. And so it begs the question of what can we do to kind of deal with that? What can we do to sort of feel better when we're kind of beating ourselves up and feeling like an imposter? And that's the spot where this emotion of compassion, which can be incredibly powerful, is so, so useful. Compassion is not just an emotion we feel towards other people. It's an emotion that we can apply towards ourselves. And the research suggests that the act of doing these kinds of meditations that bump up compassion, these meditations like loving kindness meditation, can be especially powerful. Again, this is a form of meditation where you just focus and take a few minutes to focus on what it feels like when you wish other people and yourself well. And so you might say, think of a person that you care about quite deeply, and you would think and sit and say, may that person be happy, may they be safe, may they experience joy. You kind of feel what that feels like. But then the key is that you do that for yourself. You actually sit there and think for yourself, may I be happy, may I be safe, may I experience joy. And that can be tough for some people, especially if you're the kind of person who, feels inadequate a lot of times or beats yourself up a lot. But the act of doing this, the research suggests, can allow you to feel what it feels like to give that positive emotion to yourself. And it can allow you to build up the skills that you need to do that when you're feeling like an imposter, when you're, as Menahill said, kind of having this feeling of not feeling good enough. You can say, I feel like I'm not good enough, but I like accept that. Like I'm a person too. I also deserve to experience joy. I also deserve to experience a feeling of safety and happiness. They can kind of calm down those feelings of inadequacy just a little bit. So if you're like probably a lot of the folks on here experiencing that, maybe try out a little loving kindness meditation, just a couple minutes a day of kind of devoting some compassion to yourself can be really quite powerful. Another question kind of comes up about coronavirus in particular, the sort of stress of being at home, but focuses on the kids. Elham asks, how can we overcome the stress of coronavirus and the stress for kids of staying home? And I think, I'm glad that question came up because, just like we have to put some work into our own happiness, I think we have to put some work into, making sure our kids are feeling happy and that they're experiencing some positive well-being during this time as well. What can we do to help our kids with that? Well, honestly, it's a lot of the same kinds of things that we were just talking about for adults. Those same kinds of things that promote happiness in adults can help with kids too. One of those is social connection. I know lots of friends who are doing not just Zoom calls socially with their adult friends, but allowing their kids to have play dates through Zoom calls. One of the techniques I heard, especially if you have little kids who can't really talk over Zoom and stuff like that, is to find ways to download shared activities that your kids can do. So go on a website and download like a shared coloring page or something that your child can do with another friend of theirs. So they're both doing the same activity, but doing it over Zoom. Again, those kinds of ways of doing things in real time with other people can really help out a lot. But the other techniques I talked about can also be quite powerful. One, as I mentioned before, is this power of routine. I think one of the things that is really causing a lot of stress for kids right now is that their normal routines are messed up too. And they're even more kind of activated and can feel more panicked by having, this broken routine than we do as adults. And so whatever you can do to build in some routine for your kids right now can be incredibly powerful. But the same is true for kind of regulating emotions in a positive way. What can you do to work with your kids to experience some gratitude? Maybe express gratitude together around the dinner table before you go through. Name one thing that's come out of this crisis that's been good for your family and good for you. I think all of those things can be incredibly powerful techniques, not just for the adults in life, but also for the kids. And just to follow up on things that we can do to help our families right now, Natalie asks, how can I prevent my teenagers from depression due to solitude away from peers? Family time isn't helping, exercise and healthy habits are ongoing, but sadness and worry are there. Sleeplessness is kicking in, like what can we do? Well, it's good that some of these habits are helping. And I think I wanted to start my answer to this question by, again, validating things like this is going to be a time when we're experiencing sadness and uncertainty and a little bit of anxiety. And in some ways, that's okay. Like that's to be expected. Like, again, we need some self-compassion here. Like this isn't the time if you have teenagers that they're going to be the happiest they've ever been. And that's fine. Like that they're human too. Like that is just to be expected. And so part of the answer to the question is just to have a little compassion. Like it's just going to be a tough time. But again, as we talked about with hedonic adaptation, it too will be okay. We will get through this. But in terms of techniques that can help, I think social time and kind of focusing on social time can be really powerful. Sleep hygiene is going to be incredibly important. I think if you don't have rules about technology and sleep with your kids from before this crisis, this might be the time to institute them. Especially, we know that kind of panic scrolling and looking through our social media feeds right before bed and seeing all this scary news affects adults. It's going to affect our kids even more in a more pronounced way. So what can you do with your kids, even if they're teenagers, to have them put their phones to bed? Ask them, what time do you going to go to bed? Put your phone away. Leave your phone in the kitchen. Leave your phone far away from the bedroom. Really allow yourself not to be around those screens when you go to bed. That can have a powerful effect on people's sleep habits in ways that people don't expect, but can have a really big effect. I think we don't expect with our teenagers exactly how much time they're spending on their phones, and especially where the ratio of positive stuff to negative stuff has kind of switched a little bit during this crisis. Anything we can do to kind of decrease that time on these digital technologies that's not being used for positive things like in real time connection with other people, yoga classes and so on, like try to reduce that scrolling and it can be really quite powerful. Okay, so jumping through my other questions, I have several pages of questions because you all asked so many great questions. And so I apologize in advance if I don't get to yours. But one of the things I wanted to get to is some of the questions we had were about habits and skills. And I think this is critical because, as we said, part of the battle is really putting these practices into effect in your own life. So Maha asks, why is it hard to change and build new habits? Do you recommend a book, or you can share, your greatest advice about how to make habits? And I love that you asked this question, Maha, because this is actually an odd time in our life where forming new habits, the science would suggest, might be a little bit easier than it is in our normal lives. Researcher at Wharton Business School, Katie Milkman, does a lot of work on what's called the fresh start effect. This is like times like the new year or like a big birthday when it becomes a little bit easier in our life to focus on building new habits. And it happens when we feel like we have a kind of temporal break in our life, like we go from our 30s to our 40s. Our 40th birthday can kind of feel like a big time when we're sort of starting something new. But it's also a time we also get these fresh start moments when we switch our schedules around or our habits around a lot. So if you move to a new place, if you move to a new house or new apartment, that's a great time to focus on starting new habits. What Milkman has argued is that this crazy time of coronavirus is actually a great time to think about focusing on and starting new habits, because we all have schedules that are completely different. And we all have situations that are completely different. One of the biggest predictors of whether we'll stick to a habit is a new situation. And so Katie points out that we can actually harness this fresh start effect right now to start new habits that we want. Again, with the caveat of some self-compassion, like if we're in a bad state, maybe this isn't the time. But if you have a little flexibility, this can be the time when you can start new habits that you want. Whether that's calling your elderly relatives a little more often, exercising more often, all the positive things we just talked about. Because of this strange new situation, it also makes a great time to start up different habits. But in terms of how you can change and build habits and specific books and recommendations I have for those, I'll point out a fantastic new book by Wendy Wood, who's a professor at the University of Southern California. It's called Good Habits, Bad Habits. So it should be easy to remember, but it's all about the science of habits and what you can do to harness things like context to help your habits, and how you can incorporate things like friction, the stuff that makes it a little harder to do the bad behaviors we don't want to do to improve your habits right now. So fantastic resource if you're interested in habits. But I also wanted to jump to Sahar's question about habits. So Sahar asks, why do people know what is the right thing to do, yet they don't do it? From eating healthy food or exercise to good habits, which I think is really critical, because now you all know the good habits you're supposed to be doing, but not necessarily all of you will immediately put those into practice. And one of the reasons we don't, why the human mind is so dumb like this, has to do with a weird feature of the way our brains work. And that feature is that there's different circuits in our brain that control wanting. So like how much we crave a particular thing, how much we want to do something, versus liking, how much we actually enjoy it when we really do it. So we can see the disconnect between these wanting and liking circuits most in the context of addiction. So imagine someone who has a heroin addiction, they're addicted to opiates. Their wanting circuits cause them to really go out and crave these things and really try to go after these things. But even when they get access to the drug, if they're habituated to the drug, they don't really even like it anymore that much. So they're kind of craving and wanting something a lot, even though they don't really like it when they get it. There's lots of things that have the opposite effect. For me, I could say personally, this is true for exercise. Like I get so much out of exercise. I like it a lot. I know it's so beneficial to my well-being, but even once I do it, I feel really great afterwards, but I don't necessarily crave it. It's really easy to want to stay in bed and not get up for my morning exercise class. And so those different circuits mean that just merely like what we want to do, what causes us to go out and be motivated to do something, doesn't necessarily map onto our liking, which is kind of frustrating. It sort of sucks that the human mind is organized that way, but such is the way the mind is organized. The good news is that there's one little hack that we can do to improve this connection between our wanting and liking, to kind of make it line up a little bit more. And it's the hack that we already talked about, which is this hack of mindfulness. The act of being mindful about how certain things feel afterwards, say, if I was to exercise and do my yoga class, taking a moment to notice how I felt after that, like, this feels really good. That can allow your brain to update a little bit and let your liking kick in and be like, hang on, like she's noticing that it felt really good. Maybe I should do that a little bit more often. This act of being a little bit more mindful is one path forward to kind of aligning up your habits with what you really want to achieve. In some sense, as Sahar says, like making sure you actually do the stuff that you really know you should be doing for yourself. But a different hack comes from the work of Wendy Wood that I just mentioned on habits, which is that we really just need to hack our situations to get these things to work. If you want to experience more gratitude, get a little notebook where you write down your gratitude and have it around you. If you want to exercise more, make sure you set that up so your exercise clothes are ready, or your yoga mat is down, or you have those kinds of classes queued up that you want to take during the coronavirus. If you want to be more social, make sure you take the work to set a Zoom time so the situation's a little easier. Anything you can do to move your context closer to the behaviors that you want to see will naturally allow the situations to kind of bump up your habits. And so all the things that we've talked about are ways that you can kind of promote better situations, like move your phone away at night so you can sleep better. Again, bring the yoga mat out and so on. By hacking your situation, you can often hack your habits better than we often expect. And just for a last question, I think we have sort of time to wind down because I know we've had a long session here. For the last question, I will jump into one that asks about balance and managing expectations during this scary time. And this comes from Ranim, who asks, how do we balance being kind and compassionate to ourselves in these times and not put high expectations on us, but while also doing something and being kind of productive? And I like ending with this question, because it plays on themes that we've talked about before, like self-compassion, but also on expectations. And I think I just want to end with kind of validating where this question is coming from, which is, this is an incredibly stressful and hard time, like an unprecedented time. Most of us, unless, you're 107 years old and you lived through other pandemics. In the US, we had this sort of flu in the 1918 that was around the world. Unless you've lived through that pandemic, this is a completely new experience, and it's incredibly scary and it's incredibly uncertain. And it's causing real suffering in the world, and even death and things like that. And so it's okay to kind of feel like you're not going to be at your best. And I wanted to end with this question because I think sometimes when you hear these tips, you can think, oh gosh, okay, I have to exercise more and sleep better and deal with my digital hygiene. And if you're already feeling overwhelmed, that might make you feel even more overwhelmed. But don't react like that. The main message of this stuff is self-compassion. Allow yourself the space to do what you need to do. But if that is feeling a little overwhelming, that's fine too. The key that I would say here, though, is that if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, in addition to giving yourself some self-compassion, see if there's a little baby step you can do. You don't have to exercise and run a marathon, but can you bring out your yoga mat and just do a couple stretches? You don't have to be, an expert meditator, but can you do, a minute of belly breaths? Any habit that you can do if you're feeling overwhelmed, even if it's for a minute, is going to do two things. One, it's going to help all the things that we've talked about, but it's also going to instill that you can do it. You'll get a sense of agency, and that can give you real power. And so even if you're in a position of feeling very, very overwhelmed right now, that's okay. What you need to do is what you can do and not beat yourself up. Again, this is an awful, awful crisis. It's a big first arrow, to use that analogy I used before. But you don't need to hit yourself with second arrows too. You don't need to beat yourself up. What you need to do is to take care of yourself in the ways that you're able to right now. And that's going to vary from person to person. It's probably going to vary even for you during this crisis. But if you have a little bit of self-compassion and you can allow yourself to take baby steps when you can, or even bigger steps if you have the kind of time and energy to do so, that can do a huge amount towards improving your well-being. And so with that, I think I'll end this session. What I hope I've taught you today is that your well-being is a lot more under your control than you often think. And you now have a whole set of tools that you can use to improve that well-being. Again, those might be hard to introduce sometime now if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, but you also have lots of ideas for tiny baby steps. Any of those that you get in, the science suggests will really help you out and make you feel a little bit happier. But they'll also allow you to feel happier in the context of a really scary crisis, one in which we all need to do what we can to promote our mental health. And with that, I will end. I just wanted to end with a little bit of gratitude myself to again thank the folks at the School of Life for bringing me in. I hope you've enjoyed this session, and I hope that I've given you lots of tools that can improve your mental health. Thank you all so much.